So I have a written up bio here, but it feels kind of odd to read it out because Gabby occupies the office directly across from mine, and I see her pretty well every day. Dr. Gabriela Ibarguchi joined the Arctic Institute of North America in July 2014. She's one of our Eyes High postdoc associates, and she's also the Associate Director of the International Study of Arctic Change, or ISAC. Currently, she is also serving as the lead for the bird expert team of the Terrestrial Steering Group of Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program, CAF, and the Arctic Council. She's also serving as a board member and mentor in Apex Canada. She spent the past 2 decades teaching and conducting research at Queen's and in collaboration with Environment Canada. And wow, so Gabby's done a whole lot of stuff, is what we're going to get the gist of here. And she's still doing a whole lot of stuff. She's one of our busiest postdoctoral candidates, or sorry, postdoctoral associates, not a candidate, quite obviously. Anyway, this is enough talking from me because I shouldn't be in public right now because I can't talk. So, cold adapted biodiversity in changing landscapes, a tripolar perspective, and we'll let you listen to Gabby instead of me.
Can everyone hear me okay at the back? Yes? Okay, thanks for bearing with me. Everything's a little bit slower in my life these days with my little injury here in my leg. So if I trip, you can laugh. It's okay. It's quite okay. So let me just stand over here so you can actually see the screen. All right. So while I realize we work for the Arctic Institute, I sort of never forget other parts, cold parts of the world, and they sometimes interchange biodiversity. And if you haven't thought about this too much, I hope to get you thinking about it today. And I realize the theme is a little bit different maybe of sort of our typical speaker series, so if some of this material is new to you, I am absolutely available for questions, okay? So stop me if something's unclear. Okay, so we're having a bit of trouble with switching slides. Let's see this little fella.
So just use the mouse and then on the left.
Oh, right here.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So
just use see the arrow.
oh, this one here?
Yeah.
No.
So just click right there.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, different version. There we go. Okay. So I just wanted to let you know I will talk a little bit about Antarctica, and this stems from some work that I actually started. I really started scratching the surface while I was at Queen's University, and I just want to acknowledge the people I work with: Pete Convey from the British Antarctic Survey, and Vicky Friesen, who's a seabird biologist. Okay, this is really testing you whether you had enough coffee today. And so I think many of you are familiar with the term tripolar or the 3 poles. And if you haven't, if you're not sure, basically what this refers to is the 3 sort of general cold regions in the world. So we have the Arctic and the North Pole, the Antarctic and the South Pole, as well as the alpine regions. So this third letter A, sometimes people kind of focus on the Himalayas, but in fact the term is used for a lot of people, a lot of places around the world that are alpine regions. And what they have in common is that all these regions are very cold. So when you get to very high altitude, of course, a lot of the environments that you see, you wouldn't know whether you're in Antarctica, the Arctic, or some mountain range. So, okay, so just crash course. So where are polar regions? More importantly, where were they recently? Because in terms of explaining where biodiversity is today, we may have to kind of go back a little bit. So here's a map of the general ice extent during the Pleistocene. So our ice ages, most recent ice ages. And you can see that the ice sheets actually extend, sort of quite far south in the northern hemisphere. And don't forget, in the south, sometimes because of precipitation, you might not have had as much snow, but actually these ice sheets at times extended on either side of for example, South America. So this was quite cold. And you'll see little bits of ice on this map because high altitude areas were sometimes covered by ice sheets as well. And here are mountain systems around the world. The darker, redder the areas are, the higher the elevation. And you'll notice that there are parts around the world, such as Antarctica and Greenland here, and there are mountains there, in fact. But what you're seeing here is basically the height, the elevation because of ice sheets, including this big 4-kilometer thick layers of ice in Antarctica and as well as Greenland. So these are, again, high elevation areas, but underneath, they are certainly mountains. But I want to draw your attention in particular to the Himalayas. We have a lot of regions that are clean over 5,000 meters in height, as well as some places, individual peaks everywhere, but as well as a high central Andes. These are really high mountains up here. So again, very cold environments. So I'm trying to not cover the screen at the same time as trying to hit the mouse. So what are some of the characteristics that we find in these cold environments? Well, essentially what happens in cold regions, here we are in Alberta, and you can get sleet and, really big hail one day and snow, and then sun the next day. So when you're in a lot of these really cold environments, while you might know that it's going to be cold, sometimes you don't know if you're going to get a big storm or a windstorm or how thick that snow is going to be, that layer, when you wake up the next morning. So this makes it a bit tough to predict. Also, we may have temperature extremes, so some places get very cold. But within the day, you can go from -12, -15 degrees Celsius at night to about 15, 20 degrees Celsius in the day. So again, think about enzymes and things that are functioning in organisms, and they have to kind of work in all these environments. You may also have seasonal variation that's just really extreme. So it can be really cold in the winter and then really hot in the summer, or really dry. A lot of these places undergo for example, if you think about the vegetation, you have this extended period of darkness. So certainly in the poles, you get the very long winter, right? But then as soon as the summer starts, then you have 24-hour sunlight. And that can be harsh for a lot of species because you have UV radiation basically on the species at all times, and there's very little time for cells to repair themselves and DNA to repair. So you have to basically have adaptations for that. And if you are in high altitude elevations in the tropics, for example, it can be very cold, but you might have thick layers of snow and ice, which also means that it's dark. So you have similar environments. And then of course what happens is you have these very short growing seasons. So wherever you are, if you're in the tripolar areas of the world, you have to deal with this very compressed growing season. A lot of these places are extremely windy, and they can also be very, very dry, either because the environment is dry or because the water freezes and it's unavailable. So it can't flow, you can't use it if you're a species. So a lot of the species that we see have these really amazing adaptations to cope with all of these things and actually manage to survive, reproduce, and thrive in many cases. But the problem is that there's usually a trade-off. So it's like they become super specialists. And once they do that, it's very hard to suddenly switch and do something else. So this is why we worry about landscape change, environmental change, and climate change in these regions and why they are so important. Ecologically, species may show these trade-offs and also in their life history. And I'll show you some examples. So, suspense, no. So there's many things that you might see in a lot of organisms, and actually I thought Sean was here. I think he is. So I just gave a class, actually a lecture for his class, and we talked about this a little bit. But you might see some of these traits in species that are in the tripolar regions. They may be sort of larger than average in terms of the most closely related species. Also within the same species that occupies a very large geographic area, where it's very cold, you often find that they're very large. The organisms are larger. You also find that they sometimes have very small appendages, small ears, small tails, small legs, shorter legs, and that's because it helps to reduce heat loss. You may also find that species live a longer time that you might expect for the type of organism it is. And these have potentially adaptations for very short growing seasons, like they just don't get a chance to get big enough, for example. So we'll talk about that in a minute. And you also have a lot of adaptations at the genetic level. So enzymes, these are the things that help catalyze reactions and the metabolism and everything. So sometimes they have to be adapted to work at very low temperature. And in fact, a little bit of heat can actually sometimes destroy those enzymes. So this is very, this is problematic. And then of course we see, adaptations in morphology and physiology and behavior. And in terms of reproduction, and this is where it gets critical because we're beginning to realize that a lot of species in these tripolar regions are vulnerable to becoming sort of at risk because they may not be able to reproduce as quickly as others, related species in more temperate areas, for example. So a lot of these species have fewer offspring, and those offspring tend to be fairly large. So it's a lot of investment for a parent, or if you see birds, for example, they lay very big eggs in some cases. So that's a lot of investment. And also you may have that a lot of the species have a parental care, which may be unusual, but even some insects may show parental care. And there may also be a very long period of parental care. And that also means that then that some species might not be able to reproduce every year, and that they may also wait until they're much older than you might expect to begin to reproduce. So these are some of the trade-offs that you might see in this really harsh environments. And yes, I can be goofy. So of course, like if we go back to the Arctic, I just picked on the polar bear just because I love this little guy. He's so cute. But polar bear is really textbook for adaptations to cold, right? We get this large body size. Kodiak bears can be quite large, but polar bears seem to be larger on average. Small appendages, little ears, and this helps them reduce heat loss. Females actually wait quite a while to start breeding at 4 to 6 years of age. Males, also because of very strong competition, have to wait sometimes until 8 or 10 years old to begin to reproduce. That's a long time. And then the young stay with mom about 2.5 years on average, which means that during that time, mom cannot be having other babies. So while she may get pregnant and she can actually store a fertilized embryo for months, that's 2 years that she's not reproducing every year. And again, lots of really neat adaptations. Polar bears can really last a long time fasting. Females have to do that a lot of times. And while females they're not giving birth, the bears are active all year, which is unusual because other bears have to hibernate. And then even just in terms of morphology, it's really neat. So they have black skin under the white fur, and of course they have guard hairs and really good insulation fur. And then the layer of fat under the skin can be up to about 10 centimeters thick. So it's pretty neat. I actually have talked about this example in a lecture this year. And I just wanted to give you an example of what happens when you're in really cold environments. So this little bird is called a seed snipe. I'm going to talk a little bit more about them. And they're actually shorebirds. And this is in southernmost South America. This is actually, you can find these flowers in Tierra del Fuego and the southern Andes and Patagonia. And these are called calceolaria. That's the genus name. And what you see here is these little white bodies. That's actually like a fruit, like a food reward. It's not a fruit, but it's like a food reward. So because these areas are so cold and they're also extremely windy, it makes it very hard for pollinators to survive in these environments. So you don't find as many pollinators. And so what's happened is that there has been this coevolution between seed snipes and these plants with this food reward. So when the bird is feeding on the white parts, which you've seen chewed here, these little organs on the flower actually deposit pollen on the bird's head. And that is how the flowers are pollinated. So this is one of these really neat adaptations that you see in places where you might not have the usual ecological interactions available at all times. Okay, so that's a seed snipe. This one's the least seed snipe. Okay, here are your stepping stones. You might not be able to tell where you are here in the tripolar regions of the world, and that's okay. This is just kind of to show you that you can use the parts of the, mountain range or the rock or whatever that are exposed. And if you were a hardy species, you could actually survive here. You might not be able to survive under very heavy ice, but this might be fine. So essentially, in some cases, you might be able to use these cold regions, the land masses, as a dispersal corridor. And it might seem counterintuitive, but I want to show you that what we see in the 3 poles, sometimes wild species may have originated in some of these areas. For example, if you have an ice sheet that separates populations, over time they may become reproductively isolated, so that when the ice melts and they come back into contact, they can no longer interbreed. So we certainly have many examples where species have become their own, basically separated from other species through that process. But in other cases, species may have come from elsewhere and have the right adaptations to cold to survive in other regions. And I want to tell you a little bit more about that. So, as I mentioned, I'll just going to give you, if I have a better time, I'll give you more information. But if not, I will actually point to this example, and I have a couple of slides towards the end to give you a bit more detail. These are the seed snipes, some of the birds I worked on in South America. They are only found in cold regions, and they are mountain specialists. One of the species, the leaf seed snipe, which I showed you in the previous slide with the flowers, actually inhabits lowlands as well as high altitude. But most of them like very high mountains, and they can be either very dry mountains or sort of where you have a little bit of moisture. So there are 4 species. But they're a really neat example because this seems to be an example of a species that arose in mountains, in Antarctica, and then colonized the high Andes. So this is one example where biodiversity from elsewhere has kind of pre-adapted to cold and was able to colonize elsewhere. So I'll give you a bit more information and even more detail if I have more time, but I will go back to this. And there are many examples of this. Here are 2 examples of the papers that talk about this idea of nunataks. So nunataks is kind of, imagine the rocks I just showed you that kind of stick out from ice sheets or snow. And essentially, there are cases where the nunataks, say for example, during the Pleistocene when it got really cold and these ice sheets got bigger, a lot of land that could have been good habitat became completely unusable. So a lot of species died out. But a lot of species were able to kind of climb up on the nunataks, sometimes at great altitude, and survive, even though it was pretty harsh, windy and dry and so on. But basically by doing that, they became sort of even hardier. So the ones that survived became even hardier to tolerate those cold conditions. And when the ice sheets melted, they were able to sort of colonize other parts, or basically may have become their own species. And so this has happened with a number of taxa, and including species that may have done this in mountains and then colonized the Arctic. We have examples from that in North America and Europe, and probably elsewhere around the world as well. This is kind of a neat thing. This is an example I want to show you about species that may have originated in one of the tripolar regions, the Himalayas, and colonized the Arctic, and may have done so during the Pleistocene. So here's one example. There's this what we call the out of Tibet hypothesis, and it's exactly that. The idea that some species were sort of living in alpine areas already. They were already kind of pre-adapted to cold and drought and all these other things we talked about. And basically when things got really cold during the Pleistocene, they were able basically to walk right out of the Tibetan plateau and were pre-adapted for the cold, during the Pleistocene. So this is, for example, woolly rhinos. They're extinct, of course, but they were very much present during the Pleistocene. Oh, I gotta go to this, sorry. Okay, another example, maybe woolly mammoths. So I was doing some work on hemoglobins and read this paper, which is really neat, and it's just talking about hemoglobins that have adapted to the cold. So these are the oxygen carrier molecules and how they may have been adapted for cold in the mammoth. And when you look at the sequences, I was actually smiling to myself because there are a number of sequences that these hemoglobins were being compared to. So of course these are fossil animals, so it was ancient DNA, and they were comparing to African elephants and other elephants, right? And some of them extinct. But you can actually, the closest looking hemoglobins that I was seeing from their paper were actually elephants that may have lived in the Himalayas. So here's potentially another example where these animals basically, they were in the mountains already, kind of using some of that habitat, maybe not the highest peaks, but definitely the plateau, and then kind of walked out into the, the Pleistocene habitats. No problem. Here's a recent paper. This is on Arctic fox, and there's a fossil fox that has been found in the Himalayas. And it's a new species, it hadn't been documented before, hardcore carnivore. This is not omnivorous like other foxes, this one's a hardcore carnivore, very sharp teeth. And it seems that it's very similar in its morphology in terms of at least its mandibles to the Arctic fox. And so here's potentially another example. And sorry, I am talking about Pleistocene and Pliocene and so on. The Pleistocene goes back to about 2.5 million years ago, up until about 11,000 years ago. The Pliocene goes back a bit further, and it started to get cold around the world, pretty cold, between 5.3 and 2.5 million years ago, just in case those dates are a bit weird. Okay, and this brings me to Antarctica. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Antarctica. And some of you have heard little teasers that I kind of throw out here and there. But essentially the idea was that I was really intrigued by Antarctica. As I was working on the birds from South America, I realized that they were probably an Antarctic lineage. And not only that, a lot of things were not making sense to me until I started thinking about the mountains in Antarctica that I'll tell you about in a minute. But I went on a sort of side project, kind of thinking about Antarctica as a place where a lot of species formed. And it's counterintuitive because a lot of things were dying out as Antarctica became colder and colder until you got the 4-kilometer thick sheets of ice. But turns out there's a lot of evidence around the world of biodiversity from Antarctica that's now colonized cold regions. And one of them, of course, is the sea snipes, the birds I was talking about. Very briefly, so essentially what happened was Antarctica was part of Gondwana, so the South America, Africa, Australia were attached, and other land masses. But essentially Gondwana, the supercontinent, began to break apart, and you were left with two pieces of continents, so Australia, which separated about 45 million years ago, and South America, which split off about 30 million years ago. And once 30 million years to the present happened, this basically caused Antarctica to become really isolated and even colder. So the world was cooling, no doubt about it. But then basically this circumpolar current formed. This is the Antarctic circumpolar current, and it's a massive current, and it's strong and it's deep, and it just started going around, and it just got really cold. So this is the Drake Passage. Once the Drake Passage opened up, that was basically like the floodgates of, okay, it's cold here, and you got to get out of here, or you're going to either die or you have to adapt. So that was basically what species had to do. A lot of them obviously died. And around the world, this is kind of millions of years ago, so about 38 million years ago, we actually had kind of this not so bad climate. Then it got really cold. Then it kind of cycled back and forth. But after the Pliocene, about 5 million years ago, it really got cold up into the Pleistocene, and now it's got warmed up a little bit, but never back to those records before. Okay, so here are the mountains in Antarctica, the Transantarctic mountains, and they are right here. And of course, I don't blame you if you never heard of them because they're under ice, and many people don't think about them. But they're a big mountain chain, upwards of 4,000 meters above sea level in places. And they are potentially 50 to 55 million years old. That's when they potentially began to form and really kind of become this big mountain range. And they are big. It's sort of analogous to the Himalayas as well as the Andes. And so one thing I was interested in is this idea, what I was showing you earlier, of stepping stones. So if you're a species and you're happy in alpine regions, you're happy in the cold, maybe you can just keep going and colonize all kinds of places. And I just wanted to mention that, so analogous to the Andes Mountains, Antarctica is extremely cold today, extremely cold. But up until about maybe say 20 million years ago, 50 million years ago, even 10, or even more recent than that, you may have seen environments like the ones we see in South America. This is southernmost South America. But even if some of these alpine regions, so the even regions we see, say in Alaska or in the subarctic, so you might have a lot of tundra and things like that. So these are really great habitats for a lot of species. This is the Antarctic circumpolar current I was talking about. So here's Antarctica, and basically goes around and around and around. This current powers the entire ocean basins, like basically our entire, circulation system in the world. So it's very powerful, and of course other things contribute, including the Arctic. But this current by far is probably the most important around the world. And like what I was saying, it helps isolate Antarctica, but there are parts of the ocean around Antarctica that are extremely deep. They're trenches, the sea trenches. So there's a lot of habitat there that we don't think about because sometimes it's under ice.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Why are the currents so strong, and is that an accurate representation? Because I think there's a lot more open ocean space in the south, and is that partly what drives that current structure?
Yeah, there's basically less obstructions. The bathymetry around, on the ocean bottom will definitely help kind of channel that. But yeah, that's part of it. You basically have this ginormous, this is not totally to scale, but basically, yes, you have this, no barriers at all. You have this big giant ocean, and so lots of room to do that. And the wind can go around, and the wind actually helps power this huge current. So the winds there are, that's actually my next slide. Let me show you. It's kind of creepy, but kind of cool. So if anyone's been on a ship in the Southern Ocean, I do feel sorry for you. It really hurts. The red areas on the map here, this is our winter, summer, summer, winter, because of course the seasons reverse. But the redder the areas year-round is where your strongest winds are. So the redder white areas are the strongest winds. And if you look at both maps, you'll certainly get screaming winds in the northern hemisphere. There's Alaska, and again, that's also not fun being on a ship there. But depending on what time of the year it is, it kind of goes calm. But look at this. This just gets stronger. So in a way, this may have helped a lot of species become adapted and potentially take advantage of wind. And I'm going to give you an example of that. Sorry, I don't know what happened to that arrow. And so those are the Transantarctic mountains. So don't forget, again, we have these mountains there. And there's potentially some really intriguing fossils, including fish teeth, freshwater fish, in the mountains. So at some point in the mountains, there may have been this potential ponds or lakes or at least freshwater systems. And they date between 3 and 17 million years ago, which kind of blows people's mind. But this is kind of the evidence that we're finding in Antarctica, which is sort of consistent with the story I was telling you, that this place might not have been so dull after all. And again, just comparing to the Andes are much more recent. These are maybe up to about 30 million years ago, and even younger than that, 15 to 10 million years old. So these mountains have been there longer. They have been kind of available habitat for longer. Oh, I lost my arrow. There we go. So I just wanted to mention, I don't assume everybody knows this, but if you look at biodiversity maps for the world, you'll find that mountains around the world sometimes have a lot of biodiversity. We say hotspots. And there are a lot of areas of endemism. And basically what happens is, because you have the elevation and generally, different habitat, vegetation, bodies of water, seasonal regimes, you get a lot of habitat differences that allow species to potentially be compressed instead of sort of latitudinally along the surface of the earth, basically by height. So this is what happens. So this is kind of a common thing. And so again, a lot of people haven't thought about the mountains in Antarctica, but they certainly could have been there as places where things became pre-adapted for cold and then colonized the Arctic, other mountains systems in the world, and other cold areas, including very deep oceans. Okay, sorry. Okay, so I'm just going to skip over that. So basically, I did this ginormous review because I was really interested in this, and I was looking for potential evidence of Antarctic species elsewhere in the world where it was cold, and I looked in a whole whack of places. Okay. So this is kind of what I was looking for, and this is what I found. I found overwhelming evidence of species that are now elsewhere. So I didn't do all the genetic work, clearly. I would be completely insane by now. But I was looking at publications of things, and you could also look at potentially the times of divergence. That means when species have split apart, you have an ancestor that splits into different species, you can actually look at the dates, and you can look at where those species are around the world. And that gives you an idea where they came from. So basically, I was interested in bipolar species, bipolar meaning things in the Arctic as well as in Antarctica. So that could be the same species or very closely related species, so sister lineages. You could look at boreal regions, look at mountains, where you have cold currents. For example, off the coast of Peru, you have that very cold current, the Humboldt current. The very deep ocean can be between, 4 degrees to as much as minus 4 degrees Celsius. That can be also quite cold. And then this is of interest if anyone is here in astrobiology. But you got these really, really cool environments such as geothermal refugia, caves, deserts, ice fields. And deserts are found in the Arctic, they are found in Antarctica, and they're found in other mountain regions of the world. And they can be cold. So very, very cold deserts. So yes, I found lots of evidence, and I'm going to go through the actual examples now. So, okay, bear with me because I have about a 9-page Excel table with probably between 100 and 200 records on it of examples of things that actually do fit. They're potentially Antarctic. But I'm going to give you the summary version, so bear with me. So where did I find evidence? Well, I did find it basically, for example, plants, fungi, microbes, terrestrial and marine vertebrates, and invertebrates. So yes, not a lot of charismatic megafauna, because it seems like a lot of it died off. Okay, so after about 30 million years in Antarctica, it got really cold, and it seems like a lot of things didn't make it. But I will tell you what seems to have made it and potentially is now elsewhere as well. So a lot of examples from alpine plants. There's a whole bunch of genera. Ferns. There are ferns in the tropics, but they're not in warm parts of the tropics. They're at extreme high altitude, upwards of 4,000 meters. These are cold environments, and that's where they survive basically as these little relics. Mosses, some of them stretch throughout, basically our mountain ranges in the Americas. We have invertebrates on land. We have algae, microbes. A lot of marine species seem to have colonized other parts of the world. And definitely marine mammals, shorebirds, seabirds, waterfowl, and even some fish. And I'm going to give you more examples, okay? So these are all examples of things that may have gone out of Antarctica and became either other species or potentially have sister lineages still surviving in Antarctica, particularly in the marine environment. And in some cases, we have examples of things that came from elsewhere as Antarctica was cooling and basically became the new species. And seals and sea lions are a great example of that. Seals and sea lions came basically from what's now the Arctic. And they seem to have colonized the southern hemisphere kind of slowly, and as they made their way south, they began to really apparently benefit from the cold currents that were being created because Antarctica was cooling. And by the time they got to Antarctica, there were all these different new lineages of sea lions and so on. And then some of them back colonized the northern hemisphere, example, potentially sea lions. So lots of examples there. I'm sorry, I lost my arrow. Missing. Oh, there we go. Okay. So unfortunately, so far, it looks like mammals didn't make it, amphibians didn't make it, reptiles didn't make it. So I have not found any evidence, and I have looked, of all these different kinds of animals on Antarctica with sister lineages elsewhere. They're just not there. And it looks like pretty much after the final breakup on Gondwana, it just got too cold and maybe it wasn't easy to survive. So that may change. I'm thinking maybe rodents. But even things such as vicuña and guanaco, which are related, well, they're camels, they have this wonderful distribution, and they're fossil camels, of course, in the Pleistocene and in the Arctic. But no, apparently they went around the world upwards and then down, all the way to the tip of Tierra del Fuego, or South America, I should say. But no, they were apparently not in Antarctica, at least not that any survived within the last 30 million years. And then there's something like this. There's this quote from Robert Scott, and it says, "As one looks across the barren stretches of the pack, it is sometimes difficult to realize what teeming life exists immediately below its surface." And this is so true for polar regions, and it's so true for Antarctica. So a lot of species, and we just don't realize it's there. And I realize this may not be megafauna that people recognize, but these are a lot of marine invertebrates. The level of endemism, meaning species that only are found there and nowhere else in the world, is really through the roof. So there are a lot of species, and here, just for fun, here's just an example. Every time we go and do surveys, sometimes we add new species to our records. So, endemism can be, 37% up to 70%. And sometimes there are a lot of species, Porifera, 507 species, 17 new to science, polychaete worms, etc. So there's a lot of diversity there that we just don't always recognize. And on land, same thing. We don't know our fungi very well. We don't know our microbes very well. We have tried to sample vegetation and other things, but there's a lot more that's there that we don't realize. And as an example, colambulas, a lot of insects and terrestrial invertebrates, about 72% of them are endemic. And guess what? They're lineages of invertebrates that through genetics they have been able to trace that they have survived on Antarctica since at least 9 to 15 million years ago. Genetic lineage unique to Antarctica. Somehow they survived through glaciation and 4 kilometers of ice. So it's pretty remarkable. I'm going to show you some examples of Antarctic contributions to other parts of the world. And this is in the deep sea. And this is basically from Antarctica to the north, essentially, subantarctic waters, waters in Alaska. But essentially, we have these lineages of deep sea octopuses. And they seem to have basically, colonized deep waters around Antarctica. They became very good at it. And at some point, they began to colonize through the very deep parts of the ocean where it's very cold and made it all the way to the northern hemisphere. So this is kind of where they started, and the little branches are the different lineages of various octopus species and genera and so on. And this is how far they got. So, here's, of course, Africa, but then there's the North Atlantic, the North Pacific, and we might have other species that haven't been sampled yet, of course. So it's kind of neat, and a lot of this coincides. The beginning of the speciation of these octopuses began when it began to get cold in Antarctica, example, when the Drake Passage opened about 30 million years ago. So it's a pattern you see in a lot of things. And when you do the genetics, it turns out that's their closest relatives. They're in the south, not elsewhere. Krill. So krill, there are many species of euphasids. But krill, as we know them, we know that a lot of marine mammals will undertake these massive migrations to the southern hemisphere to feed on krill. And in particular, superba, Antarctic krill, is very, very important for baleen whales. And when people have done the studies of genetics to look at them, it looks like they began to really get going in terms of forming species around 24, 25, 28 million years ago. So again, opening up that Drake Passage, began to get colder. That seemed to be good for krill. They quite liked it there. And interestingly, I have a theory about this. When you look at whales, baleen whales, so we have a number of whales. We have your toothed whales, such as dolphins and orcas and so on. And then you have a whole bunch of other species of whales that have the baleen, and the way they feed is that they strain water, the seawater, and they trap the krill, and they consume enormous amounts of krill, several tons, of course. And when you look at how whales began to form species, well, your older whales were basically the toothed whales, and then they began to split into different lineages. So that by about 28 million years ago, you have this split between what we now sort of recognize as the toothed whales and the baleen whales. So the whales that actually have the baleen, and they strain the marine invertebrates. And the bluer the color here means that these are sort of the Antarctic, like the species that not only make it to the Antarctic, but may undertake very long migrations to get there and really, really exploit those krill sources as one of the main prey. And when you look at when these things began to take off again, about 28 million years ago to the present, and when you look at when things began to form in terms of species, a lot of times it seems to coincide with speciation in the krill species. And so what's neat is that I wonder, we always wonder about whether once you have the prey, then you kind of have the predator, and then speciation in one thing can lead to speciation in another thing. So speciation cascades. So anyways, kind of neat little puzzle. Different people are working on it, but it sort of occurred to me one day, and I put the dates on that. And it's kind of neat. It's probably one example of many where things have, again, really taken off, not just because of the cold, but indirectly because the prey took off, and now there's all this diversity of food sources. I'm actually going to skip this next slide, okay. Seabirds. I don't want to bore you with all the details, but you have a similar pattern. So we have a lot of seabirds actually have a very strong southern distribution. So a lot of species in the southern hemisphere, probably Magdalena, what you were saying, you have all this ocean, right? And so a lot of species really took off exploiting this big ocean. So a lot of seabirds, again, a lot of species there, and the darker the blue, it means that a lot of these species are newer and are more cold adapted. And these are several families of seabirds with this, and a lot of times you get this sort of post 30 million years and to the present speciation, and the colder it got, then you got even more speciation. So the seabirds didn't seem to be bothered by the cold, they seem to really like it, actually, but quite well.
Just to get on that topic a bit, there's a whole series of islands when you go to the southern oceans.
Yeah.
Just before you get to Antarctica, was that a bridge, or how did that affect that whole movement and migration?
The Scotia Arc?
Yeah.
I think of the Scotia
I
Arc.
just thought there's a whole series of whether you look at Latin America or get into the
Yeah.
Indian Ocean.
Yeah, actually, I don't know about the ones in the Indian Ocean. I haven't paid as much attention, but certainly the ones in South America, the Scotia Arc, there's this island chain, Georgia. There are a lot of them that could have served as a stepping stone. So even things that couldn't fly, if you had, for example, vegetation, if the seeds or parts of the plants could be dispersed and basically make it onto land, of course, it didn't necessarily happen overnight, but over millions of years, you could potentially colonize using the stepping stones. So yeah, I think it's very plausible. Yeah. So a lot of seabirds. This is another one of my favorite puzzles. These are the albatrosses, and again, don't worry about all the detail, but essentially same thing. I just wanted to show you that the first thing is I'm throwing up this map here, the wind, to remind you that the wind patterns in the southern hemisphere are really strong, and actually albatrosses are beautiful experts on wind. They don't have to land for a very long time. They just glide on the wind, and basically where you have wind is where you have albatrosses. So I kind of thought about wind being a potential force in the speciation process of albatrosses, because that was there. And then you have ocean and all this stuff. And what's really neat is, again, same thing, you look at the dates where species began to split off. And we do have some albatrosses in the northern hemisphere, but they seem to have potential originate in the south and then colonize the north. But most species are in the south. And again, the darker the blue, the more cold-hearted they are, the more sort of farther into Antarctica they are. And the dates, again, sort of are obviously post-cooling, but sometimes it coincides with some of the prey they're feeding on. So there's a colleague working on the actual prey, and I'm really curious to see his most recent results of that. So going back to the bigger picture, sorry about that, Antarctica. So this is kind of neat, right? So you see this disjunct species that are closely related, and they don't necessarily fly very far in some cases, and they're completely in different parts of the world, sometimes very similar habitats though. And would you believe it? I found examples of freshwater fish that could have potentially been in Antarctica because they're found here and potentially in New Zealand or Australia. Now clearly, freshwater fish don't survive very long in salt water. Sometimes they do, a short amount of time. Sometimes eggs survive for a short amount of time, or sometimes there's a phase that survives in salt water. But otherwise, if you think about the circumpolar current though, that current is fast. And if you had habitat here that could have been used, freshwater habitats in tundra or somewhere else, that potentially helps us with that puzzle. So there are many other examples. There are a lot of non-migratory water birds. They don't fly across continents, and they split off about 10 or even 9 or 8 million years ago. Clearly, potentially Antarctica is the puzzle piece that's missing. Marine fauna for the Arctic, Antarctica and the Arctic, nowhere else. Sometimes you have these bipolar species. And so I show you some of the octopuses that do have potentially other species elsewhere, but essentially they're bipolar. Medusoa, there are a lot of marine invertebrates that have these bipolar disjunct distributions, and they're Arctic or Antarctic and nowhere else. So how do they get there, right? So potentially they may have originated actually in Antarctica and then colonized either through the deep ocean or potentially somewhere else. So in terms of land, mountains seem to be the key. And so again, lots of shorebirds and seabirds, and they have these weird bipolar distributions. A lot of shorebirds migrate huge distances between the Canadian Arctic and, say, Tierra del Fuego. What started that pattern? Well, the key might be that they actually originated in Antarctica, and then they now exploit this, this really great food resources, the insects that emerge in the short growing season. And this doesn't work. Sorry, habit. And again, I told you a little bit about plants already. And I think the plants are a really good way to study mountains and those corridors simply because they potentially have been there a long time. And they're easy to trap. And there's some really funky examples. This lichen, Usnea lichen, has deep lineages, very old lineages in Antarctica. And guess what? They've colonized all the way up to the Rockies multiple times. So they've colonized the Andes from Antarctica, up the Andes, and as far as the Rocky Mountains. And this is potentially recent in the last few million years. So that's kind of neat. There are these mites surviving Nunatak in Antarctica. And there's some researchers working on them, and they think they're sort of pre-adapted for mountains. So again, potentially Transantarctic mountains, they didn't say, but And they're probably elsewhere in the southern hemisphere. We just haven't looked for them. Because again, there's so many species we haven't really even described. So lots of examples, whether they're birds or insects so I do have time. I'm just going to give you a very quick crash course. So there's the seed snipes. These are the birds I studied in South America, cold adapted. And so the neat thing about them is that there are 4 species, and they are shorebirds. I know they don't look like that, but they are. And their closest living relative is the plains wanderer, Predominant, in Australia. Now, the seed snipes are, again, endemic to South America, the Andes, Patagonia, and Tierra del Fuego, period. They're not in warm areas. And they're herbivorous year-round. And basically, their relative is, like other shorebirds, insectivorous. That's a main food source. Basically, both are non-migratory. They don't undertake this bipolar migrations or anything of the sort, although they're very good flyers, so these guys sometimes can undertake altitudinal migrations. And so it seems like they're the closest relatives to each other, and basically I was very intrigued by this Antarctic alpine ancestor, because it seems that seed snipes have been using mountains for a very long time. So I did some genetic work, and I won't bore you with all the details, but essentially there seems to be this pattern of colonization of the Andes from south to north. I don't know if yeah, okay. So there's a little arrow, south to north. And essentially, the take-home messages from this is that when you look at divergence times of the species, so the plains wanderer in Australia and the sea snipes in South America split off about 46 to 49 million years ago. What was happening then? Well, Australia and Antarctica were separating. The mountains, the Transantarctic mountains, were already present. They were there. So they were potential habitat. And again, one of the main distinctions between these two families of birds is that the sea snipes like alpine areas, the plains wanderer doesn't. It uses grasslands. And then when you look at the genera within seed snipes, we have basically 4 species. 2 are sort of intermediate altitude. 2 of them are, tree line specialists. They like it, whereas they're basically above tree line. And their age of split basically predates the modern Andes. So where were they living before that? So clearly, we have to kind of think about Transantarctic mountains. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but if anyone has questions and wants to talk about the birds, let me know afterwards. I just threw this back on here just to remind us again, back to this life histories. I'd love to talk to you about sea snipes and all these other cool adaptive things. But here's an example of a flightless midge from Antarctica, endemic species. And I put it here as a poster child because a lot of the species in Antarctica and elsewhere, high altitude and the Arctic, we know many examples where there are these trade-offs ecologically. So this species will need several years to become an adult. Years. This is an invertebrate. And in the Arctic, we have a lot of examples of that too. So if you imagine having competitors around as climate changes, things that can produce young and potentially even reach adulthood in 1 season or 2 seasons, they might outcompete species like this. And we have to think about, as the environment is changing and as climate is changing and as we make our presence known elsewhere in the world, we bring a lot of stuff with us, but even just thinking about the environmental and climate change, we're going to start seeing a lot more of these genetic mismatches. So this idea that phenology, which refers to the timing when things happen, when things know they have to reproduce or migrate or produce young or wean young or whatever it is, part of that is genetically determined, and there's an environmental cue, usually, not always. But so as this is changing faster than species can adapt and evolution can proceed, basically you're going to get this mismatch between behavior. So when things are migrating in order to, say, capture the most prey, maybe they kind of miss it. They get to the Arctic and now the prey, the insects have already emerged and have potentially begun to die. So these are problems that are already happening. So in terms of hibernation, how many of you have seen the little the rabbits that are running around campus and they're completely white? It's sad. I got a picture of that. But think about all of this mismatches, right? And genes basically determine enzymes and proteins, and when these things are not matching their environment, that's going to be a problem. Basically, that's what I wanted to illustrate here. So we're beginning to actually see this, and this could be a problem from anything that changes color. Ptarmigan, foxes, a lot of things in the Arctic, but also elsewhere that have different plumages or things to camouflage better so predators don't find them. Well, guess what? That's kind of what we're seeing here, which is not good. So these things are happening. And so that's what we worry about, whether species can adapt fast enough, because it really is a lottery. It's about having the right genetic makeup in the right place at the right time, and obviously that's kind of your parents give that to you. So and people obviously worry about species moving around and then invading polar regions or the alpine regions that didn't used to live there before, and the idea of introducing genes that don't belong to that population. So as species move and they begin to hybridize with the resident populations that are potentially already adapted to those conditions, the intermediate hybrids may not be very good for that environment. There may not be good there or good here. So that can be a problem. But another view is that perhaps some of these genes can actually be useful because maybe species can adapt fast enough. So there's this kind of foreign genes being introduced through hybridization from, say, the south or other places. Maybe species can generate enzymes that are a bit more tolerant of slightly warmer temperatures, for example, or whatever it is. So we don't know what's going to happen. There's probably going to be different scenarios for different species. And then we'll see stuff like this. So, okay, so as we know, polar bears are not doing very well. They're quite hungry. There's no sea ice. They need to hunt seals, which means that they have to come onto land earlier than they normally would be. So they're very hungry. And I began to think about polar bears and what they would maybe manage to eat. And of course, other bears are more flexible in their diet, and a lot of bears fish, and they're very good at it. Polar bears, not so much. They're learning. And so this is a very tacky ad from the internet, but I've started to see this. And the bears, again, are not very good at it, but they're learning. And so they're potentially learning to use a resource they haven't really used that much before. And this was the very first paper I ever saw. This was only 2007. I was kind of thinking about this, and then a colleague of mine published this paper on fishing, polar bears fishing. Whether that be enough for bears to survive and actually reproduce, I don't know. And of course, we know that grizzlies and other species are moving northward and potentially hybridizing, in this case, grizzly bears and polar bears. Whether grizzlies, which are very generalist, they're happy with a lot of different foods, whether they're going to be just fine and their babies are going to be super happy, and the polar bears might not. They usually have two cubs, maybe they'll go down to one. We just don't know. But these are kinds of things that we can track, so to see if we see body size changes over generations or how they do in terms of reproduction. But things can adapt, that's for sure. It might just take some time. And so we have to be worried about the shrinking islands of habitat. And just have a couple more slides. I've mentioned this to a couple of people. I don't see as many studies of this as I'd like to because this is happening, but this is a modeling study in Norway, and it actually applies to Scandinavian countries, but also potentially to Alaska, Canada, anywhere where we have mountains. Essentially, if you have climate change and the vegetation begins to change moving northward, so tree line begins to move up, you're going to lose a lot of your sort of alpine habitats or Arctic or subarctic habitats. And this can be happening around the world where you have mountains. And also it could be happening, in high latitudes as well. So that's quite disturbing. And and that's all I wanted to say. I want to leave a few minutes for questions. I just wanted to thank a lot of people who have just thrown stuff at me, and I kind of ran with it. Vicky Friesen at Queen's, Tony Gaston, Environment Canada, a lot of Seabird work with them. Steve Lockheed worked a lot in the Andes, not as much now, but he used to. And Pete Comey did the British Antarctic Survey. Thank you, that's all. So that was a lot of information. That's what's inside my brain about cold regions in the world. But does anyone have any questions or comments or stories about something you've seen?
Are there any flies in the Antarctic?
Yes,
Like
there
the
are.
black flies?
I don't know about black flies. I don't know the species in Antarctica, but they're basically a lot of represented terns, absolutely. And some of them are flightless. Yeah. But in terms of things that are blood feeding There are not as many because we don't have a lot of land mammals. There are introduced rats and mice and subantarctic islands, but actually on the continent, except for the the Antarctic Peninsula, it's pretty harsh. But they would definitely thrive probably near penguin rookeries and things like that. If there's some, I'm sure there are probably some biting insects, but probably not as many as we have in the Arctic with all the ungulates and muskox and all this prey.
With the melting of some of the ice caps, is that providing you any more information that affects your studies?
You know, there are a lot of people beginning to study not just the polar regions, but the mountains. And unfortunately, a funny thing happens. We're in the northern hemisphere, we seem to keep track of mountains a little bit better. But a lot of the highest mountains are actually not in the northern hemisphere; they're in the southern hemisphere, and sometimes there are not as many resources for science. So people have recently started to go in, and certainly there are weather stations and things like that to monitor, but sometimes getting those data is hard. But this is where remote sensing comes in, and it's been really wonderful. We were really lucky to go to the American Geophysical Union this last fall, and we had to work, but I was trying to sneak in a talk here and there because, of course, people are beginning to realize that they can use the time series to go back and look at the loss of the alpine habitats, and oh yeah, it's happening. It's definitely happening, and it's a shame because there are a lot of really unique species that have survived, and so they're endemic, essentially. Yeah.
Are there any species that you've thought of perhaps have started in the north and then ended up going south? And one that I have in my head is the Arctic tern, which breeds in the north, just hangs out in the south. So, but are there any that you would think, rather than south to north, maybe went north to south?
Yes, and actually it depends how far back in time you go. What seems to have happened is that during the Pleistocene and the Pliocene, when it got cold, so 5 million years ago, and then of course, say 2 million years ago, the cold water masses around the poles kind of began to come northward and potentially kind of connected. And again, think about places where we have cold currents already, so off the coast of Peru, so we have the Benguela current and the Humboldt current and other currents. And they seem to actually have potentially crossed the equator somehow. Maybe a little bit in the deep, but they did. And so I think when you had these episodes, there were chances for things to potentially back colonize to the north and then come back south. And for the Arctic tern, I haven't thought about it too much, but it seems like the origin of the modern birds that we recognize is potentially Gondwana. So, but if you go forward, then of course we have oxen, a lot of pteridopter forms that kind of really took off in the northern hemisphere instead of the south. So that's a great question. I don't know about the Arctic tern, but definitely seals are beautiful examples. The camel relatives, I'm really intrigued by that. And I wonder if essentially at some point we'll be lucky to find fossils somewhere in the mountains of camels that may have survived, because like it's just a neat distribution. And then frogs, I was interested in frogs too, and it looks like frogs colonized the entire globe, and skipped Antarctica. So they probably were wiped out very early on, maybe, I don't know, 40, 50 million years ago from Antarctica. So, but yeah, there are lots of examples. If anyone wants me to share my table, I'm happy to do so. It might hurt your eyes, but there's everything from protists to ferns.
What is the mechanism for dispersal of things like ferns and lichen from Antarctica? Do the birds eat those things?
Well, you know what? A lot of things may just kind of waft off in wind. Not just propagules, but also even plant parts. There are cases, if you think about everything that's, for example, on Hawaii or some of these remote islands, a lot of things got there by just floating on seawater. Sometimes after a storm, maybe things were in logs. You know, it's amazing what manages to disperse. And that's always a really neat puzzle for me. In the case, so specifically, I think there's just a whole bunch of different mechanisms, but certainly definitely attaching things that become attached either on the surface of birds, or potentially things that are in the marine environment, so even sea turtles or whatever, maybe some things actually manage to get across. But also, if things get ingested, and then, so birds sometimes ingest a lot of things, and seeds can be dispersed that way. In fact, there's some studies of invasive species getting basically spread around by birds inside the digestive tract so they don't get destroyed and they germinate. So yeah, there may be some really interesting ways of getting around. And I think if people look at that current, there is a lot of similarity in the flora between New Zealand and Chile, which may date back to Gondwana, but particularly the current that's going around, wind and water, it's so strong that it might allow things to survive that normally, say for example, if you normally would take a month to get somewhere, but it actually takes say 15 days or 10 days because you're going to such a fast current, it might allow some things to survive that are really surprising.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gabby. That
Thank
was
you.
awesome.
Thank you, everyone.